The quiet village, nestled in the embrace of mist-wrapped hills, welcomed Haruto with the scent of damp earth and the distant chime of a temple bell, its resonance lingering like a whisper of solace. His geta clattered softly against the cobbled streets, each step a measured echo of the fatigue that clung to his bones. The air was thick with the clean, grassy aroma of fresh tatami mats drying in the sun, mingling with the earthy fragrance of roasted green tea from a nearby shop bitter, yet familiar, like the memories of his childhood before the blade had defined his days. He paused beneath the eaves of his modest home, the smooth, weathered wood cool beneath his fingertips as he slid the door open, its quiet shudder a contrast to the cacophony of battle still ringing in his mind. Inside, the dim light filtered through paper screens, casting shifting patterns on the floor like fleeting thoughts he could not grasp. His katana, still sheathed at his hip, felt heavier than ever, its presence a weight both literal and spiritual. The sharp, almost imperceptible sound of its draw haunted him, a sound that had once symbolized honor, but now carried the ghosts of countless faces, their silent accusations etching deeper than any wound. Kneeling on the tatami, he exhaled slowly, the scent of polished cedar and the faint musk of silk from his kimono grounding him as he arranged the tea set with trembling hands, the porcelain clicking softly against the lacquered tray. The steam rose in delicate swirls, carrying the astringent bitterness of matcha, a taste that mirrored the conflict within him, the warrior's code demanding loyalty to his lord, yet his soul yearning for the stillness he had glimpsed in the monks who moved through life like water, effortless and unburdened. He closed his eyes, the rhythm of his breath uneven at first, then gradually settling into the cadence of the wind through the pines outside, a sound as ancient as the mountains themselves. In that silence, he remembered his master's words. The blade is but a tool, the true battle is here. A fingertip traced the edge of the teacup, smooth and unbroken, yet so easily shattered like peace, like life. The flicker of a lantern's flame danced in the draught, its light fragile yet persistent, much like the hope that still flickered within him. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, their patter on the roof, a gentle reminder of cycles of storms that passed, of soil that drank and grew fertile anew. For the first time in months, Haruto dared to imagine a path unmarred by bloodshed, where mastery was not measured in cuts, but in the quiet discipline of a mind at peace, where the gods might judge him not by the lives he had taken, but by the moments he had truly lived. The weight of his katana remained, but in the space between breaths, he wondered if he could learn to carry it differently. The village lay beneath the autumn moon, its thatched roofs silvered with cold light, the air crisp like the first bite of a persimmon, yet fragrant with the last sighs of chrysanthemums clinging to garden fences. Haruto knelt by the open shoji, fingertips tracing the smooth grain of the cypress floor, grounding himself in its steadiness as memories flickered like candle shadows bodies fallen in mud. The metallic reek of blood, the way a blade's arc could silence a man mid-breath. The moon's glow here was soft, almost tender, washing over the cobbled paths where children's geta had clattered at dusk. So unlike the fractured moonlight of battlefields, shattered by the glint of drawn steel that whisper-thin sound, like ice splitting underfoot, that still coiled in his muscles even now. He inhaled deeply, the clean scent of freshly woven tatami and steamed rice from the hearth below, threading through the bitterness of matcha on his tongue. Its astringency, a mirror to the conflict in his chest. The teacup trembled in his grip, a hairline fracture in his composure. The kiln-fired clay bore the fingerprints of some quiet artisan, a life spent shaping instead of severing. Outside, wind stirred the maple leaves, their rustle like the pages of sutras turned in distant temple halls, reminding him of his master's words. A sword sheathed gathers no blood, but neither does it shine. His thumb brushed the silk wrapping of his katana's hilt, cool and seamless as a river stone, yet the weight of it dragged at him an anchor or a chain. The moon climbed higher, casting the village wells into pools of ink, and for a breath, Haruto imagined dipping his hands into their darkness, washing away the grit of campaigns, the way the monk had shown him at the mountain shrine, murmuring of karmic tides. A night heron cried from the reeds, the sound lonely and ancient as the stars. Slowly, he unclenched his jaw, exhaled until his lungs hollowed, and closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids, the scent of tea merged with the memory of his mother's incense, the sticky sweet pine resin from his childhood hearth. And for the first time in years, the sword at his side felt less like a limb and more like a thing he could one day lay down, a tool, not a soul. The moon watched, impassive as the Buddhas carved into temple gates, and the wind carried away the last of the day's heat, leaving only the cool promise of dew before dawn. The afternoon light slanted through the paper shoji screens, casting delicate shadows across the tatami mats that released their subtle, sun-warmed fragrance of straw and earth clean. Simple, anchoring, Haruto knelt, hands resting on his thighs, fingers curled just slightly, as if still expecting the weight of a sword's hilt. Across from him, his mentor, the old samurai Takeshi, moved with the quiet precision of a crane through water, his gnarled hands pouring steaming matcha into a chowan. The bitter, vegetal scent of the tea mingled with the faint incense lingering in the air, a whisper of sandalwood and something deeper, like aged parchment. Haruto's breath hitched as the porcelain touched his lips' heat, then the earthy tang flooding his tongue, a contrast to the iron taste that so often filled his mouth after battle. Takeshi did not speak, but his silence was an open gate. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobblestones echoed like a distant heartbeat, the sound fading as passers-by moved beyond the courtyard wall. A breeze slipped through the open engawa, carrying the damp chill of impending rain, and the faintest trace of cherry blossoms springs fleeting defiance of time. Haruto's thumb brushed the rim of the cup, smooth and cool. Yet his other hand clenched reflexively, a tremor betraying him. He thought of the blade at his hip, its saya silent but heavy, the way it hissed when drawn, a sound as sharp as the split between duty and desire. Is this all there is? The question coiled in his chest, tighter with each campaign, each life taken in the name of honor. He remembered the first time he'd struck down a man, the spray of rain on his face, the way the blood had steamed in the cold air, his own breath ragged, as if his lungs could never again fill completely. Takeshi exhaled, long and slow, and Haruto mirrored him instinctively, the air leaving his body like a tide retreating from shore. The older man's eyes, dark as river stones, held neither judgment nor praise, only stillness. In them, Haruto saw the reflection of his own face, the furrow between his brows, the shadow of exhaustion no sleep could lift. The tea's dregs swirled as Takeshi set the chowin down with deliberate care, the wood of the table polished to a mirror sheen beneath it. A single leaf, carried by the wind, skittered across the floor, and for a moment Haruto tracked it as he might a foe's blade, his body taut, trained to react. But the leaf was only a leaf, and the tension bled from his shoulders. Outside, a temple bell tolled, its resonant hum threading through the quarter, a reminder of the monks who moved through their days without swords, their battles fought in the quiet of zazen. Could I? The doubt was a knot in his throat. Takeshi leaned forward, the rustle of his silk kimono like the sigh of reeds in a stream. "The sword is a master," he said, voice weathered but clear, "but it is not the only teacher." The words settled like dust motes in sunlight. Haruto closed his eyes. Beneath the layers of discipline, beneath the weight of his name and lineage, something stirred, not peace, not yet, but the memory of it. The way the dawn painted the training yard in gold, the scrape of the whetstone along steel, the perfect, fleeting moment before a strike, when the world held its breath, his fingers uncurled. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet stone now, the promise of rain thickening the air. Somewhere beyond the walls, a cuckoo called, its voice a bridge between worlds. Takeshi smiled, barely more than a crease at the corners of his eyes, and poured again. The tea's steam rose in fragile spirals, vanishing like ghosts, like the aspensions of a path not yet taken. Haruto lifted the cup, and this time his hand did not shake. The tatami mats exhaled the clean scent of dried reeds as the young samurai knelt, his calloused hands resting lightly on his thighs. The faintest tremor in his fingers betrayed him. No amount of discipline could still the memory of his last duel. The way his blade had sung through the air with a sound like parting silk. The metallic tang of blood blooming in the cold morning. Across from him, the elder moved with the gravity of mountains, his gnarled hands cradling the chowin as though it were a bird's egg. Steam curled from the matcha, bitter and green, its aroma a balm against the phantom stench of smoke and iron that clung to the samurai's thoughts. Outside, the wind teased the shoji screens, carrying the distant clatter of geta on cobblestone's mundane, ordinary life, moving on without him. The elder poured with ceremonial slowness, the liquid dark as a river at dusk. To draw the sword is to carry the weight of 10,000 lives, he murmured, and the words hung in the air like temple incense. The samurai's breath hitched. His ribs ached with the ghost of armor straps biting into flesh. He remembered his father's voice, rough as unpolished stone. A warrior cannot unmake his edge. But here, in this quiet space, the only sharpness was the scent of tea, the only cuts the shafts of sunlight slicing through the dim room. The elder's fingers traced the rim of the bowl, polished smooth by generations of palms. The blade and the lotus grow from the same mud, he said. A cherry petal drifted through the open screen, brushing the samurai's knee pink against indigo silk, fleeting as the lives he'd taken. Somewhere beyond the garden, a blacksmith's hammer rang, rhythmic as a monk's chanting. The samurai closed his eyes. In the darkness, he saw the arc of his katana, moonlight shearing along its curve like a vengeful god's smile. But beneath that vision, deeper, lay the stillness of the meditation hall. The press of woven grass against his knees, the slow unfurling of his lungs, the moment before dawn when the world held its breath. The teacup warmed his palms, its heat a reminder fingers could cradle as fiercely as they gripped a hilt. The elder smiled, teeth like weathered pearls. To master the sword, he said, you must first master the hand that wields it. A breeze stirred the samurai's topknot, carrying the salt-fresh scent of distant tides. Somewhere the tide would always turn. Somewhere a forge would always burn. But here, now, there was only this. The weight of the cup, the ache in his thighs, the petal wilting on his knee, and the unbearable, fragile hope that peace might yet be a thing lived, not just longed for. The scent of sun-warmed tatami, and the faint, earthy bitterness of freshly whisked matcha filled the dimly lit tea room as Haruto knelt, his calloused fingers tracing the smooth edge of the low wooden table. Outside, the whisper of cherry blossoms brushing against the shoji screens mingled with the distant, rhythmic clatter of geta on cobbled street sounds of a world moving inexorably forward. While he remained suspended between duty and desire, the weight of his katana at his side was familiar, yet its presence now felt like a chain, the polished saya cool against his thigh, the tsuba's intricate metalwork pressing into his palm as he gripped it, unthinking, as if seeking reassurance in its unforgiving solidity. He exhaled, slow and deliberate, the air leaving his lungs like a silent prayer. But the turmoil within refused to settle. Memories flickered his father's stern voice echoing bushido, the way his mother's hands had shaken as she tied his hakama before his first duel, the sickening clarity of blood on snow after his blade had found its mark. The tea before him steamed, its surface a perfect, unbroken mirror. Yet all he saw was the fracture in his own resolve. His fingers twitched, betraying the stillness he fought to maintain. The tremor was slight, but it spoke of sleepless nights and a soul fraying at the edges. The scent of pine from the incense holder coiled into the air, its smoke curling like the ghosts of decisions unmade. Is this all there is? He wondered, staring at the way the candlelight licked the grain of the cypress wood, revealing patterns both delicate and unyielding like the code he'd sworn to uphold, beautiful in its precision, ruthless in its demands. The wind shifted, carrying the crisp chill of approaching autumn, and with it, the faintest chime of temple bells, a reminder of the peace he craved but could never quite grasp. He had mastered the art of the draw, the swift, silent lethality of a blade leaving its sheath, but here, in this quiet space, he envied the monks who moved through life with no weapon but their breath. The tea cooled, its bitterness lingering on his tongue as he lifted the cup, the ceramic warm but no longer scalding. Much like the fire of his ambition, once all-consuming, now tempered by doubt. The flicker of the lantern cast long shadows across the scroll hanging in the alcove. A single stroke of ink, a crane in flight. Freedom, a thing of grace, unbounded by earth or obligation. His throat tightened. To confess his longing would be to dishonor his name. To ignore it would be to betray himself. The silence stretched, thin as rice paper, until the weight of it became unbearable. "Sensei," he began, the word crumbling like dried leaves in winter. "I no longer know if the path I walk is mine." The admission hung in the air, fragile as the petals drifting past the window, and for the first time in years, he did not flinch from the truth. Somewhere beyond the walls, a stream murmured over stones, patient, endless, carving its way toward the sea. The elder's words hung in the air like the faint fragrance of green tea steaming from a chipped ceramic cup. Its bitterness, a quiet echo of the young samurai's unrest. The tatami beneath his knees breathed the scent of fresh straw and old wisdom, woven with the memory of countless souls who had knelt there before him, seeking answers he now longed to grasp. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, a rhythmic sigh that seemed to mourn the blood he had spilled, the lives he had taken in the name of a code that once felt noble, but now weighed like a rusted blade on his back. His fingers, calloused from years of gripping the katana, trembled slightly as they rested on his thighs, not from fear, but from the unspoken yearning for something beyond the sharp, metallic song of steel being drawn. That sound so precise it could split silence like a prayer. The flicker of candlelight painted the shoji screens with ghosts, and for a moment, he saw his own reflection in the polished wooden floor. A face hardened by battle, yet eyes still soft with the boy who once marveled at fireflies in the rice fields, their glow as fleeting as the peace he now sought. The elder's voice, smooth as silk sliding over sheathed blades, broke the silence. "To walk the path of the moon," he said, "is to embrace the shadow as well as the light. The words stirred something deep within the young warrior, a memory of his master's funeral, where the smoke of incense had curled like the tails of dragons ascending to the heavens, carrying with it the unspoken grief of a life spent in service to violence. He exhaled slowly, the air leaving his lungs like a tide retreating from the shore. And in that pause, he felt the weight of his armor, not just on his shoulders, but on his soul. The moon, that silent observer of centuries, had watched samurai rise and fall, their battles written in blood and their regrets lost to time. To follow its path was to step away from the clamor of the world, from the relentless clatter of geta on cobblestones as men rushed to war, and instead to seek the stillness of the meditation garden, where the koi traced endless circles in the pond, their motions as deliberate as the strokes of a calligrapher's brush. He closed his eyes, and the scent of crushed pine needles mingled with the distant salt tang of the sea, carried on a breeze that had crossed mountains and temples to reach him. Somewhere beyond the walls, a nightingale sang a single, plaintive note that seemed to pierce the veil between the earthly and the divine. The elder's challenge was not merely a test of discipline, but an invitation to unravel the paradox of his existence, how to honor the way of the warrior while surrendering to the quiet mastery of the self. The moon, after all, did not fight the darkness. It simply was, its light a reflection of something greater. And as the young samurai bowed his head, the weight of his sword at his side no longer felt like a burden, but a question one he would answer not with the edge of his blade, but with the depth of his breath, the steadiness of his hands, and the slow, deliberate steps of a man learning to walk in harmony with the night. The morning air was crisp, with the faint tang of pine and distant incense as Haruto stepped onto the worn stone path leading to the secluded temple, his geta clattering softly against the cobbles, each step a measured echo of his uncertainty. The temple grounds were hushed, save for the whisper of wind through bamboo and the occasional chirp of a hidden warbler sounds that seemed to sharpen his awareness, as if the world itself held its breath. Inside, the scent of fresh tatami mats, straw woven tight and clean, mingled with the earthy bitterness of matcha prepared by unseen hands. He knelt on the polished wooden floor, the cool smoothness seeping through his hakama, and let his fingers trace the edge of his sheathed katana, its presence, a familiar weight, the razor-sharp sheen of its draw a sound etched into his bones, though now it felt less like a call to battle and more like a question. A single shaft of sunlight pierced the dim hall, dust motes swirling in its beam like the fragments of his resolve. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady the tremor in his hands, the tremor that came not from fear, but from the weight of a choice, the code of bushido, with its steel and blood, or the quiet promise of the altar before him, where a single sprig of cherry blossom dying, yet radiant, rested beside a scroll of sutras. The tea bowl in his palms was warm, its glaze uneven where a craftsman's fingers had molded it centuries ago. and as he drank, the bitterness bloomed on his tongue, a mirror of the clash within him. Memories surfaced, his father's stern praise after his first duel, the way the morning mist had clung to the fallen opponent's sleeves like ghostly fingers, the laughter of farmers he'd passed in the valley, their hands deft among rice shoots, while his grip knew only the hilt of a sword. The temple bell tolled, deep and resonant, vibrating in his ribs as if to remind him that time, like the seasons, moved regardless of a man's turmoil. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness, he imagined the gods of old watching not with judgment, but with the patience of stone, as if to say that even the fiercest river could be stilled if one knew how to listen. The scent of ink from the sutras curled into the air, and for a breath, he let himself forget the weight of his name, his lineage. The expectations coiled around him like armor. Here, in the silence between heartbeats, was a different kind of mastery. The blade had taught him precision, but the temple whispered of harmony, not the absence of strife, but the grace to move through it, like wind over water. Outside, a petal drifted from the cherry tree, and he wondered if peace, too, might be something he could catch before it touched the ground. The young samurai knelt upon the tatami, its crisp, grassy scent mingling with the faint aroma of steamed rice and bitter matcha that lingered in the temple's corridors. The morning air was cool, carrying the distant hum of a bell struck by the wind, its resonance like a whisper from the gods. Before him, the monk placed a chowan of tea, the ceramic ruff under his calloused fingers, the steam curling into the slanting light that filtered through shoji screens. "Breathe," the monk murmured, his voice as steady as the stones in the garden outside, not as a warrior, but as a man. The samurai closed his eyes, but behind his lids flashed the memory of his blade, leaving its saya that fleeting, lethal hiss, and the way blood darkened the earth like rain soaking into parched soil. His fingers twitched against his thigh, restless as a sparrow trapped in a cage. The monk's own hands rested, palms up, on his knees, as motionless as the moss-crusted statues of Jizo in the courtyard. The samurai inhaled, slow and deliberate, but the air caught in his chest like a snag in silk. He could still hear the clatter of his geta on the castle's cobbled streets, the way his sword's tsuba had gleamed under the moon, cold as winter steel. For years, the weight of his katana had been comfort, and burdened both its presence a reminder of duty, its edge a promise of violence. Now, the monk asked him to release even the thought of it. "The mind is a river," the old man said, pouring tea with a precision that spoke of decades of practice. "Struggle and you drown. Be still, and it carries you." The liquid pooled dark and shimmering, reflecting the samurai's furrowed brow. He yearned for that stillness, for the way the temple's ancient cedars stood unmoved by storms, roots wrapped around the bones of the mountain. A breeze stirred the incense smoke, its sweet, piney coils unraveling like the threads of his doubts. He exhaled, and this time his shoulders sank only slightly, but enough that the monk's lips curled into the ghost of a smile. Outside, a maple leaf drifted onto the stone lantern, its edges just beginning to blush with autumn's touch. The samurai focused on it, the way it trembled without fear, knowing the wind would take it where it needed to go. Perhaps this was the mastery he had sought all along, not the sharpness of his blade, but the surrender to something older, vaster. The tea cooled in his hands, its bitterness now softened by a fleeting sweetness, like forgiveness after long strife. The monk's words settled into his ribs, light as the first snow quiet, inevitable. Again, the old man said, and the samurai obeyed, breathing in the silence between heartbeats, where peace at last began. Haruto knelt upon the tatami mat, its woven straw exhaling a faint, dry scent of sun-baked reeds, clean, uncomplicated, unlike the acrid tang of blood that still clung to his memory. The morning light, soft and hesitant, spilled through the shoji screen, painting the polished wooden floor with shifting lattices of gold. Before him, the chowan of matcha sat undisturbed, its bitter green surface a perfect, unbroken mirror. He lifted it with both hands, feeling the warmth seep into his palms, but his fingers betrayed him a tremor, slight as a leaf's shiver in the wind. The tea rippled, distorting his reflection. His breath hitched. How many times had those same hands gripped a katana, drawn it with that lethal, whisper-thin sound shink like winter wind through bare branches? How many lives had ended at their motion? The question coiled in his gut, serpentine. Outside, the rhythmic clop-clop of geta on cobblestones drifted in, a woman's laughter tangled in the noise. His jaw tightened. Such ordinary sounds, such ordinary joy. Would he ever know it again? The blade at his side felt heavier than steel, weighted with every unspoken oath, every face he'd watched slacken in death. He closed his eyes, seeking the void, the clarity his master spoke of like still water, Haruto. Only then can you see the moon. But the chaos remained, the cries of battle crows, the crunch of gravel under fleeing footsteps, the way his own breath had roared in his ears like a tidal wave. A bead of sweat traced his temple. He exhaled slowly, counting the seconds, pressing his palms flat against his thighs as if to anchor himself. The silk of his hakama was cool beneath his fingertips, a fleeting comfort. Somewhere beyond the garden, a sparrow trilled, heedless of wars and codes. For a fleeting moment, he envied it its purpose simple, its existence untouched by bloodied honor. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine from the distant mountains, and with it, a memory. His father's voice, low and frayed with disappointment. A sword is more than a weapon. It is the soul's mirror. But what soul did his reflect now? A fractured thing, torn between duty and the gnawing pull toward something softer, something like the way the tea's steam curled upward, delicate, dissolving into air. His thumbs brushed the chowan's rim. Again, he commanded himself. Breathe. Again. The battlefield was gone. The past was past. Here, now, There was only this breath, this bowl, this light. And perhaps if he could still his trembling hands, if he could let the weight of his blade fade here, now, there might also be peace. The young samurai knelt on the tatami mat, its fresh, grassy scent mingling with the faint whispers of incense curling through the still air of the monastery hall. Before him, the low table bore a sheet of pristine paper, its surface waiting like an unbroken snowfall. And beside it, the inkstone cradled a pool of liquid darkness. His breath steadied, a deliberate attempt to quiet the restless currents in his chest, echoes of steel clashing, the screams of battle that clung like smoke to his memories. The monk's silent presence beside him was a gentle anchor, a reminder of the discipline he sought, even as the weight of his sword at his hip seemed to pulse with every heartbeat. His fingers, calloused from years gripping the katana's hilt, trembled slightly as he lifted the brush, the bamboo cool and smooth against his skin. The first stroke demanded everything, the tension in his wrist, the measured exhale, the way the ink bled onto the paper like a sigh released after long restraint. Each movement was a mirror of his soul, hesitant, yet yearning for grace. The tip of the brush dragged with purpose, black lines curling into the character for peace. A word he had chased across bloodied fields, and now sought in the stillness of his own hand. Outside, the wind stirred the temple's maple leaves, their rustling a murmur of time's passage, a reminder that even warriors were but fleeting brushstrokes in the vast scroll of history. The bitterness of green tea lingered on his tongue, its astringency a counterpoint to the sweetness of this quiet mastery. With every stroke, he felt the old craving, the way his muscles remembered the sharp draw of his blade, the lethal precision of ai-jutsu, the terrible beauty of a cut laid bare in moonlight. But here now, the battle was with himself, with the tremor in his fingers that betrayed his unrest. The monk had spoken of the gods watching through the ink's flow, of each line a prayer, a pact between earth and heaven. The samurai's next breath deepened as the brush hesitated, then dipped once more. This time, the stroke was sure, a river finding its course at last. For a moment, the world narrowed to the whisper of bristles on paper, to the slow unfurling of something delicate and unbroken within him. The scent of pine and damp stone seeped through the open shoji screens, the evening air cool against his neck. Was this harmony? Not the absence of conflict, but the balance within it, the way the brush could be both weapon and vessel, the way a life could hold both honor and stillness. The lantern's glow flickered, casting long shadows that danced like old ghosts across the page. He leaned back, the final stroke complete. The ink gleamed wet under the light, a fragile, perfect thing. And in that silence, for the first time, he wondered if peace was not a place to arrive at, but a path one drawn slowly, stroke by stroke. The storm howled outside the small, dimly lit dojo, its fury rattling the wooden shutters and sending gusts of rain lashing against the paper-thin shoji screens. Inside, Haruto knelt upon the tatami mats, the clean, earthy scent of woven reeds mingling with the faint aroma of freshly brewed matcha, bitter yet grounding, like the weight of his thoughts. The flickering lanterns cast shifting shadows across the polished wooden floor, their light catching the gleam of his unsheathed katana beside him, its blade so sharp it whispered as he'd drawn it, a sound like winter wind through bare branches. His fingers hovered over the cool steel, trembling ever so slightly, not from fear, but from the exhaustion of a soul split between duty and desire. The tempest outside mirrored the chaos within him, the clash of his warrior's oath, heavy as the armor he'd abandoned, against the quiet yearning for something beyond bloodshed, something as serene as the temple gardens where he'd once watched cherry blossoms fall like silent prayers. He closed his eyes, drawing a slow breath, the air thick with the damp chill of the storm, and let the rhythm of the rain steady him. Each drop tapped against the roof like the footsteps of restless ghosts' ancestors, perhaps, or the countless faces he'd crossed blades with, their voices swallowed by the wind. The bitterness of the tea lingered on his tongue, a reminder of the discipline he sought, the mastery of self that felt as elusive as the moon behind the storm clouds. His teacher's words echoed in his mind. The sword is not just a weapon, but a mirror. Yet what did it reflect now? A man fractured, or one on the precipice of understanding. Outside, thunder rolled like a distant drum of war, but Haruto remained still, his palms pressed flat against his thighs, the rough silk of his hakama brushing his skin. In this moment, the storm was his witness, the dojo his sanctuary. The wind screamed, the walls groaned, but he held fast, seeking in the eye of the chaos the same stillness he'd glimpsed in the monks' meditation halls where breath became prayer, and pain transformed into peace. The clatter of his geta on the cobbled streets yesterday felt a lifetime away, yet the memory of those hurried steps, the weight of his untethered soul, anchored him here now. The storm would pass, the blade would wait, and for the first time, he dared to believe that so, too, might his turmoil. The full moon hung like a pearl in the ink-black sky, its pale light seeping through the open shoji screens and pooling on the tatami mats, their woven reeds releasing a faint, clean scent of sun-baked straw that mingled with the earthy aroma of freshly whisked matcha. Haruto knelt in seiza, his spine straight but not rigid, the silk of his hakama whispering against the floor as he adjusted his posture. The night air was cool, carrying the distant murmur of the wind through the pines, a sound like the breath of some ancient kami, sighing through the centuries. His katana lay before him, its scabbard gleaming in the moonlight, the black lacquer smooth as still water beneath his fingertips. He closed his eyes, letting the weight of the blade's presence sink into him, the hunger for mastery, the shadow of bloodshed. The silence was so deep he could hear the subtle rasp of his own pulse in his ears, the shift of fabric as his chest rose and fell. Then, barely audible, the whisper of steel as he drew the blade an inch from its sheath. the sound sharp as a winter branch snapping underfoot. His fingers trembled ever so slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of choice, the clash between Bushido's stern call and the quiet voice that had grown louder in him, the one that whispered of ink brushes and incense, of stillness instead of strife. Outside, a single petal from the courtyard's cherry tree drifted down, its journey as unhurried as the turning of the seasons. And for a heartbeat, Haruto felt himself part of that cycle, neither warrior nor wanderer, but something older, something that belonged to the earth and the sky. The bitterness of the tea lingering on his tongue was like the taste of his own doubts, sharp and cleansing. He exhaled, long and slow, watching the steam from his breath merge with the night. In that suspended moment, the past and the future fell away. The clatter of geta on cobblestone, the shouted drills of the training yard, the scent of burning torches after battle, none of it could reach him here. There was only the moon, the blade, and the breath. And then clarity. Like mist parting before the dawn, it came not as a thunderous revelation, but as a quiet settling, as if his very bones had aligned with some deeper truth. The katana was not just a weapon. It was an extension of his soul, a bridge between discipline and devotion. The code of the warrior did not demand violence, it demanded honor. And honor could be found in the restraint of the blade as much as in its swing. For the first time, the tension in his chest eased, replaced by a warmth that spread through him like the first light of morning. The moon's glow seemed to brighten, tracing the curve of his sword with silver, and he knew, with a certainty that needed no words, that peace was not the absence of the warrior's path, but its highest form. The petal touched the ground. Haruto sheathed his sword, the click of the guard meeting the scabbard a seal upon his newfound resolve. The night held its breath with him just for a moment before the wind stirred again, carrying the scent of blossoms and the promise of change. The young samurai stepped onto the cobbled village path, the rhythmic clatter of his geta echoing through the hushed streets as dusk settled like a held breath. The air carried the damp, earthy scent of impending rain, mingling with the faint smokiness of hearth fires being stoked for evening meals. His fingertips brushed the smooth, cold saya of his katana, its presence at his side, both familiar and burdensome. Like the weight of a promise he was no longer sure he could keep. The village seemed quieter than he remembered, or perhaps it was his own stillness that muted the world around him. The distant laughter of children, the murmur of merchants closing their stalls, the rustle of silk as a woman adjusted her obi all flowed past him like river currents around a stone. He paused beneath the eaves of the tea house, where the sharp, grassy aroma of freshly whisked matcha wafted through the shoji screens, stirring a memory of his master's hands moving in deliberate ceremony. The tea's bitterness a lesson in clarity. Inside, the tatami mats exhaled the clean scent of woven straw, and for a moment, he saw himself kneeling there years ago, a boy with eager fists, believing the sword alone would carve his destiny. Now his hands trembled slightly as he untied his sandals, calloused palms tracing the worn wood grain of the step, as if grounding himself in something solid, something unchanging. The last light of day slanted through the screens, painting gold the motes of dust that danced between stillness and motion, like the unresolved tension in his chest. He inhaled deeply slow, measured as his master had taught him, imagining his breath as a thread connecting him to the generations of warriors who had knelt here before him, their ghosts whispering of Bushido's pride and its price. Outside, a crow cried, its voice sharp as a blade's edge, and he thought of the cherry blossoms he'd passed on the road, their petals clinging to life before the inevitable fall. Was there not honor, too, in surrendering to the wind's gentler currents? The tea master's bell chimed, a single clear note that seemed to hang in the air between heartbeats, and he knew then that his path was not one of abandonment, but of transformation to wield the sword not as an instrument of death, but as a brush painting restraint upon the canvas of chaos. The resolve settled into his bones like the evening cool, fragile yet undeniable, as he slid open the door and stepped into the warmth. The scent of fresh tatami mingled with the bitter steam of green tea as Haruto knelt in the quietude of the village tea house, his calloused fingers tracing the smooth curve of the untouched cup before him. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobbled streets whispered of ordinary lives he had once vowed to protect, though the weight of his katana at his hip now felt like a chain rather than an honor. The blade's edge, polished to a mirrored gleam, caught the fragile morning light, and for a breath, he saw not his reflection but the faces of those he'd cut down, their ghosts lingering in the razor's whisper as he'd drawn it from its sheath. The air was thick with the fragrance of pine from the nearby hills, yet beneath it lurked the metallic hint of impending rain or blood. His chest tightened, a tremor skittering through his lungs as he exhaled, slow and deliberate, the way his old master had taught him to steady a restless spirit. Meditation had once been a ritual of clarity, but now the silence only echoed with dissonance. The clash of steel in memory, the Buddhist sutras murmuring of mercy, the unyielding code of bushido that demanded his arm rise even when his soul begged to fold. Then chaos erupted shouts, the acrid tang of smoke, the panicked stampede of villagers as bandits surged through the streets like wolves among sheep. Haruto's body moved before thought, his hand closing around the hilt of his katana, the same motion he'd practiced 10,000 times. Yet now his fingers hesitated, slick with sweat against the silk wrap. A child's wail sliced through the noise, and in that instant, he was back in his own childhood, hiding beneath the floorboards as raiders burned his home. The scent of charred wood and his mother's stifled sobs seared into his bones, the past and present blurred. The blade was no longer just steel, but a crossroads between the warrior's duty and the peace he'd sought in the monastery's incense-heavy halls. Between the man he'd been forged to be and the one he ached to become, the bandit lunged at a fleeing woman, his knife a flash of teeth, and time fractured. Haruto's breath hitched not in fear, but in recognition. This was the moment the gods had whispered of in the rustle of cherry blossoms, in the monk's admonition that true mastery was not in the cut, but in the hand that chose not to strike. Yet choice was a luxury the village did not have. With a cry torn from the depths of his divided heart, Haruto stepped forward, his katana singing free of its scabbard, not with the fury of a demon, but with the precision of a man who understood the cost. The clash of steel rang like a temple bell, each parry a prayer, each step a dance between destruction and salvation. The bandit's eyes widened as Haruto's blade halted a hair's breadth from his throat. The lesson of centuries coiled in that suspended breath. The warrior's path was not in the taking of life, but in the sparing of it. Around them, the fight stilled, the villagers gaping as the bandit dropped his knife, his defiance crumbling like autumn leaves beneath frost. Haruto's arm trembled, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of revelation, the way the river smooths the jagged stone, the way the cherry tree blooms brightest after the harshest winter. He lowered his sword, and in that surrender found the thing he'd sought all along, not peace without struggle, but peace within it. The first drops of rain began to fall, washing the dust from the cobbles as the village exhaled around him. The afternoon sun filtered through the paper shoji screens, painting the dojo's tatami mats in soft, golden stripes, their clean, grassy scent mingling with the sharp, earthy perfume of freshly whisked matcha. The young samurai knelt, his calloused hands resting on his thighs, fingers trembling faintly not from fear, but from the weight of the choice he had yet to make. The stillness of the room was broken only by the distant murmur of the wind through the pines outside, a sound that always carried the whisper of his father's voice. A blade is drawn only when the soul has already cut. He exhaled slowly, the air cool against his lips, and let his gaze drift to the katana resting beside him. Its polished saya gleamed, smooth as river stone beneath his fingertips, but the sight no longer quickened his pulse with the old fervor. Instead, it filled him with a quiet sorrow, like the fading echo of a bell struck long ago. The tea before him steamed, its bitterness a familiar companion, yet today it tasted of something more, not just of discipline, but of the life he might have lived had he been born beneath a gentler sky. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobbled streets rose and fell, a reminder of the world beyond the dojo's walls, a world he was taught to protect but never truly inhabit. The tension coiled in his chest, a serpent of duty and desire. His master's words echoed in his mind. To master the sword is to master the self. But what self remained when the sword was laid down? The question gnawed at him, as persistent as the cicadas' drone in the summer heat. He closed his eyes, letting the silence press against his skin, and inhaled again, deep and deliberate, as if he could draw peace into his very bones. Then the shouts. Rough voices slicing through the afternoon's calm, the scuff of hurried footsteps, the metallic rasp of steel being unsheathed. His body moved before his mind could follow muscle memory, carving a path through the chaos. The bandits crashed into the dojo, their breaths loud and ragged, their eyes wild with greed. One lunged, his crude blade flashing. Time slowed. The samurai's hand found his katana, the whisper of its draw sharp as a winter branch snapping under snow. But instead of the killing stroke, he twisted, his movements fluid as a heron skimming water, and guided the bandit's momentum past him. The man stumbled, his weapon clattering to the floor. Another came, then another, each disarmed with the precision of a calligrapher's brushstroke, a flick of the wrist here, a light press of the flat of his blade there, until they stood weaponless, panting, bewildered. The samurai stepped back, his own breath steady, his heart a quiet drum in his chest. The bandits' faces were mirrors of his own disbelief. He had not killed, had not needed to. The realization settled over him like the first frost, delicate and transformative. Around them, the dojo seemed to exhale, the tatami's fragrance rising anew, the late sun gilding the dust motes drifting in the air. For a moment, he felt the presence of something greater, the kami in the wood, the ancestors in the wind, and understood, with a clarity as bright as the moon on a cloudless night, that mastery was not in the taking of life, but in the sparing of it. The bandits, shamefaced, bowed low and fled, their footsteps fading into the hum of the awakening evening. Alone again, the samurai knelt once more, his katana across his lap. The tea had gone cold, but he drank it anyway. The bitterness now mingled with something sweeter, something like hope. Beyond the screens, the first fireflies flickered to life, their tiny lights weaving through the gathering dusk. He smiled just slightly, and let the stillness fill him, as deep and endless as the sky. The festival lanterns cast a warm, honeyed glow over the village square, their light trembling like fireflies against the indigo dusk. As Haruto knelt on the weathered wooden engawa, the clean, grassy scent of fresh tatami mingling with the earthiness of roasted sweet potatoes from the stalls below. The villagers' laughter rose in waves, buoyant as the steam curling from his untouched cup of matcha, its bitterness a quiet mirror to the ache in his chest. He had sheathed his blade today, though the scent of iron still clung to his memory like a ghost. The drunkard's knife had flashed toward him with a flinty whisper, and for a breath, the old hunger had roared in his veins, the bone-deep reflex to cut first, to let his body move as it had been trained. But then the man had stumbled, his bleary eyes widening like a child's, and Haruto's hand had frozen on the lacquered saya, its polished wood smooth as a river stone under his palm. Now the weight of his restraint sat heavier than any victory. A child darted past, geta clattering on cobblestones, and pressed a sprig of plum blossoms into his lap, their petals fragile as the trust in the villagers' eyes when they bowed to him earlier, their gratitude not for his edge, but for his stillness. The tea cooled as he exhaled, long and slow, his breath syncing with the distant chant of monks from the hillside temple, their voices threading through the wind like needles, mending torn silk. He closed his eyes, but the memories needled him anyway. His master's sword arcing through dawn mist, the way its blade had caught the light like a smile before severing the thief's neck. Mercy is the luxury of the unburdened. The old man had snipped, flicking blood from the steel with a practiced twist. Haruto's fingers hovered over his own katana now, tracing the mekuge's rough bamboo peg beneath the wrappings. Control was supposed to be the pinnacle of bushido. Yet every time he knelt in the dojo's hush, each deliberate motion of folding his hakama, each measured sip of tea, he felt less like a warrior and more like a shadow straining toward substance. A moth brushed his sleeve, its wings trembling against the dark blue silk, and for a fleeting moment, he envied its simplicity to live only for the light, to die without ever knowing the blade. The villagers' drums thrummed in his ribs, their rhythm older than the shogunate, older than kami themselves, and something in him unraveled. He lifted the tea to his lips, its bitterness now tempered by the sweetness of the blossoms in his lap. Perhaps this was mastery, not the absence of violence, but the presence of choice. The moon rose, its silver edge sharp as a katana's kiss, and Haruto smiled not in triumph, but in recognition. The path ahead would still be lined with unsheathed steel. But tonight, the wind carried the scent of rain, and the earth beneath him was quiet. The young samurai knelt upon the tatami mat, its woven rush grass releasing a faint, clean aroma like sunlight on dry earth, mingling with the earthy bitterness of freshly whisked matcha. The steam curled upward in delicate tendrils, vanishing as if swallowed by the silence of the dojo. His calloused fingers trembled slightly as they rested on his knees, the ghost of his last duel still clinging to them, the slick warmth of blood on his palms, the sharp, singing sheeing of his katana leaving its saya. A sound so precise it seemed to cut the air itself. He exhaled slowly, willing the tremor to still. Outside, the distant clatter of wooden geta on cobbled streets reminded him of the world beyond these walls, a world of clashing steel and staccato orders, of honor bound too tightly to violence. The autumn wind slipped through the half-open shoji screens, carrying the crisp scent of decaying leaves and the damp promise of evening rain. It brushed against his face, cool as the silk of his hakama against his skin, a whisper of transience. How many breaths remain before I must raise my blade again? He wondered, tracing the grain of the polished wooden floor with his fingertips, smooth as river stones worn by time. The tea's bitterness lingered on his tongue, a mirror to the ache in his spirit, the conflict between Bushido's relentless demands and the quiet yearning that had taken root in him, fragile as the first frost. His sensei's words echoed, "True mastery is not in the strike, but in the space between breaths." He closed his eyes, sinking deeper into Seiza. The weight of his swords at his hip was both burden and anchor, their presence a covenant with the ancestors, with the gods who shaped warriors from clay and fire. The candle's flame flickered, casting shifting shadows like restless ghosts across the scroll of the Bodhidharma on the wall, its unblinking ink, eyes a challenge. To meditate is to confront the self as an enemy, he thought. Yet the blade that cuts the ego must be forged in stillness. His chest rose and fell, slower now, each breath a thread weaving him back into the loom of the moment. The distant caw of a crow broke the silence, and for an instant he was a boy again, watching his father's sword gleam under the midsummer moon, believing then that honor was a pure, uncomplicated thing. Now the truth coiled inside him like a serpent. The gods demanded both war and wisdom, and the path to harmony lay not in rejecting one for the other, but in holding the tension like the taut string of a bow. The light deepened to gold as sunset bled through the paper screens, painting the room in the hues of a fading bruise. He lifted the chowan, feeling its rough ceramic against his lips, the heat seeping into his bones. Tomorrow he would train footsteps precise on dew-laden gravel, the bakken an extension of his breath, each movement a prayer to the balance he sought. For now, he let the stillness claim him, knowing that in this fragile discipline, both warrior and seeker could exist not as rivals, but as mirrors reflecting the same ceaseless, sacred duel, the struggle to transcend the self without forsaking it. The elder's voice was as soft as the whisper of wind through bamboo, yet it carried the weight of centuries. "You are not the same man who first knelt on these tatami mats," he said, the scent of fresh straw mingling with the earthy bitterness of green tea cooling between them. The young samurai lowered his eyes, feeling the smooth, polished wood beneath his palms, the fabric of his kimono rustling like autumn leaves. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobbled streets echoed the pulse of the world he once moved through so restlessly, always chasing, always cutting, now stilled. The elder's words settled into him like the deep breath before meditation, the kind of breath that carried the sharp, almost imperceptible sound of a blade being drawn, though no steel had left its sheath. He remembered the tremor that once lived in his hands, the way his heartbeat had drummed against his ribs before battle, how the morning mist clinging to his skin felt like the ghosts of those he'd felled. But now, there was only the cool touch of silk against his wrists, the warmth of the sun filtering through shoji screens, painting gold across the kneeling mats, each ray a silent witness to the quiet alchemy of his spirit. The elder's gaze was steady, reflecting the still surface of a temple pond. "Your sword no longer thirsts," he observed, and the samurai felt the truth of it in his bones. Once he had believed mastery lay in the arc of his blade, in the way blood blossomed like crimson chrysanthemums in the snow. Yet here, amid the incense and the hushed rustle of monks' robes, he had found another path, the deliberate unfurling of a hand, the way his breath could slow time itself, the taste of tea bitter yet cleansing, like the acceptance of all he had been and all he might yet become. The conflict had not vanished, the warrior's code still coiled within him, tight as the strings of a biwa, but it no longer choked him. He thought of cherry blossoms, how they fell without regret, how the earth received them without question. A sparrow alighted on the veranda, its tiny claws scraping against the wood, a sound so slight, yet it resonated like the strike of a temple bell. The elder smiled, and in that smile, the samurai saw the patience of mountains, the knowing of old stones worn smooth by rivers. Restlessness is just motion without purpose, the elder murmured. But you have learned to listen. And he had. In the space between breaths, in the way the steam curled from his tea like the smoke of forgotten battlefields, in the silent vows he made to the dawn, he had found it, a peace as deep as the forging of a katana, as enduring as the stars that guided his ancestors. The sword at his side was no longer a chain, but a promise not to take life, but to honor the fragile, fleeting beauty of living. The morning sun filtered through the paper shoji screens, casting a soft, golden haze over the dojo's worn tatami mats, their straw scent mingling with the sharp, clean aroma of freshly whisked matcha. Haruto knelt at the head of the room, his calloused hands resting on his thighs, the fabric of his hakama cool against his skin. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobblestones echoed as villagers began their day. But here, in this quiet space, time seemed to slow. The children sat before him in hushed anticipation, their small faces alight with curiosity, their breaths syncing with his own, a mirrored cadence, steady and deliberate. He inhaled deeply, the bitter tang of green tea lingering on his tongue, and let his gaze drift to the katana resting beside him, its scabbard gleaming like a river under moonlight. The blade had once felt like an extension of his soul, a tool of purpose, yet now, its weight carried the ghosts of lives taken, the echoes of battles that had never truly brought him closer to honor. He closed his eyes, feeling the tremor in his fingers as they brushed the tsuka, a silent confession of the conflict within. The warrior's code demanded discipline, demanded the sharpness of steel, but his heart longed for something quieter, something as vast and untouchable as the wind through the pines. With deliberate slowness, he lifted the sword, the whisper of steel against wood slicing the stillness, a sound so faint it was felt more than heard. The children gasped, their eyes widening as the morning light caught the blade's edge, turning it into a sliver of captured dawn. A sword is not merely a weapon, Haruto murmured, his voice like the distant murmur of a stream, but a mirror. It reflects the soul of its wielder. He moved through the first kata with measured grace, each motion a prayer, each pause a breath held between past and future. The tip of the blade traced an arc through the air, slow as the turning of seasons. And for a moment, he was no longer in the dojo, but beneath the cherry blossoms of his youth, his master's voice reminding him that true mastery was not in the cut, but in the stillness after. The memory was a weight and a balm both. One of the children, a boy with sun-darkened cheeks and eyes like burnt honey, mimicked his stance, tiny hands gripping a wooden bakken. Haruto adjusted the child's posture with a gentle touch, his fingertips brushing the boy's shoulder, a fleeting connection, like a leaf brushing the surface of a pond. "Feel the earth beneath you," he instructed, "steady as the mountains. Let your breath be the tide, rising and falling without force." The boy nodded, his small chest expanding with effort, and Haruto felt something unknot inside himself. This was not the brutal dance of combat, but something older, purer, the passing of knowledge, the shaping of spirits rather than their severing. The scent of dew-damp grass drifted through the open door, carried on a breeze that stirred the children's hair and set the wind chimes humming a fleeting symphony of bronze and air. He lowered his blade, the steel catching the light one last time before settling back into its scabbard with a sigh. The children's faces were serene now, their earlier restlessness tempered by the ritual's rhythm. Haruto smiled, though the expression carried the weight of centuries. Of all the warriors who had come before him, their blood and sweat sewn into the fabric of this art. "To wield the sword is to walk a narrow path," he said, pouring tea for each child, the steam curling like incense toward the ceiling. "But remember, the greatest battles are fought here." He touched his chest, where his heartbeat thrummed in quiet rebellion against the violence of his past. The bitterness of the tea bloomed on his tongue, a reminder that clarity often came with discomfort. Outside, the world moved on. Merchants called their wares, crows cawed from the temple roof. The village breathed and lived, but here, in this fragile space between breaths, Haruto felt something akin to peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the mastery of it. And perhaps, he thought as the children bowed in unison, that was enough. Under the next full moon, the young samurai knelt upon the tatami mat, its tightly woven straw releasing a faint, earthy scent, mingling with the delicate aroma of freshly whisked matcha that curled steam into the still air. The night was quiet save for the distant murmur of the wind through the pines and the occasional rustle of silk as he adjusted his posture, the fabric sliding cool against his skin. The shoji screens were drawn open, letting the silver glow of the moon spill across the polished wooden floor, transforming it into a still river of light. His hand hovered over his sheathed katana, its presence as familiar as his own breath, the lacquered scabbard smooth beneath his fingertips. With practiced control, he drew the blade just enough to hear that whisper-thin sound of steel parting from wood. The quiet hiss, a reminder of the violence that had once defined him. He paused there, letting the weight of the weapon settle in his grip, remembering the first time he had taken a life. The shock of blood warm on his hands, the way the world had narrowed to a single, terrible moment. He exhaled, long and slow, and slid the blade back into its sheath. The click of the kisaki meeting the koiguchi marking an end or perhaps a beginning. The bitterness of the tea lingered on his tongue as he lifted the chowan, the heat seeping into his palms, grounding him. He had spent years chasing perfection in the dojo, his body honed into an instrument of war. Yet each victory had left him emptier than the last. Was this all there was? To cut and be cut, to live by the edge of a sword until the edge claimed him in turn. The moonlight traced the calluses on his fingers, the scars on his knuckles, and for the first time, he did not see the marks of a warrior, but simply the hands of a man trembling, uncertain, alive. Outside, a nightingale called, its song threading through the darkness like a needle through silk, and he closed his eyes, surrendering to the rhythm of his breath. The air was cool against his skin, carrying the damp scent of dew-kissed moss and the distant tang of the river. He imagined his worries dissolving like ink in water, spilling into the stillness around him the shame of disobedience, the fear of weakness, the gnawing doubt that he had strayed too far from the bushido he once revered. But beneath it all, quieter yet more insistent, was something else. The first fragile stirrings of peace. It felt like the space between heartbeats, like the hush before dawn, like the moment just before a blade finds its mark, when time itself seems to hold its breath. He had spent his life moving, striking, striving, but here, in the moon's pale embrace, he finally understood what it meant to be still. The clatter of geta on cobblestones echoed from some far-off street, a reminder of the world beyond these walls. But he did not stir. Let them pass. Let the night march on. His fingers brushed the wrap of his katana once more, not with longing, but with reverence for the path he had walked, for the lessons etched in steel and blood, for the choice that now lay before him. The moon climbed higher, its light shifting imperceptibly across the floor, and in that silent progression, he saw the truth. Mastery was not in the sword, but in the hand that wielded it. Not in the cut, but in the decision to stay the blade. The wind sighed through the trees, the pines nodding as if in agreement. And as the last of his resistance melted away, the young samurai smiled not with triumph, but with understanding. The harmony he had sought was never in the absence of conflict, but in the balance between the warrior and the man, the blade and the breath, the moon and the night it painted anew.